All right, welcome everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the fifth session of our webinar series, Dismantling Anti-Blackness in Education. I'm Tambra Jackson, the Interim Dean for the School of Education at IUPUI, and I'm delighted to have you all present with us this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation we get to have this evening with our panelists about anti-Blackness in communities of color. As part of our mission, the School of Education is committed to examining our collective role in improving the human condition, and we do this with an explicit focus on social justice, inclusive of anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives and actions. Tonight's event is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about anti-Blackness in order to help inform our work and action for education equity. The specific focus on anti-Blackness for this series is intended to increase our understanding of what is at the root of why Black children lead many negative statistics in education and what we all can do to disrupt that narrative. As noted by Kiana Mariah Ross in her June 24th, 2020 op-ed in the New York Times, quote, "Racism fails to fully capture what Black people in this country are facing. The right term is anti-Blackness. To be clear, racism isn't a meaningless term, but it's a catch-all phrase that can encapsulate anything from Black people being denied fair access to mortgage loans to Asian students being burdened with a model minority label. It's not specific. Many Americans awakened by watching footage of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck are grappling with why we live in a world in which Black death loops in a tragic screenplay scored with the wails of childless mothers and the entitled indifference of our murderers. And an understanding of anti-Blackness is the only place to start. Anti-Blackness is one way some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defames it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence," end quote. During this evening, we will have an opportunity to hear from our phenomenal featured panelists and pose questions to move our thinking and actions forward about anti-Blackness in communities of color. Given tonight's panel topic, I want to offer that a focus on anti-Blackness does not diminish or negate issues of racism in other BIPOC communities. Thus, I acknowledge the recent anti-Asian racism and violence occurring across the country. While we know that anti-Asian racism and discrimination is not a new phenomenon in our country, the recent influx of violence is a reminder of how racism cannot be reduced to isolated incidents, but rather there is a system of inequity and white supremacy that allows for such violence to be described as a bad day for the perpetrator. We stand in solidarity with our Asian brothers and sisters in the fight against racism. And we encourage you tonight in this webinar to use the chat function to dialogue with each other. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function and we'll try to respond as quickly as possible. And now I'd like to pass the mic to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Monica Medina.
Thank you very much, Dean Jackson. Thank you to all of the presenters that are here this evening. And to those of you who are with us, hoping to hear more from our presenters. We understand that anti-racism must be understood within the context of anti-Blackness. And we have this evening 4 individuals who will stimulate our thinking around tonight's topic, anti-racism in communities of color. So each speaker has prepared 10 minutes of remarks. Allow me now to introduce our speakers, starting with the first speaker for this evening, Mr. Dr. Kyle Mayes. Dr. Mayes is a writer, a transdisciplinary scholar of Afro-Indigenous studies, urban studies, and indigenous popular culture. He earned his doctorate in history in the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is an author of Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Moderny, and Hip Hop Indigenous North American, which was published in SUNY Press in 2018. And he also has a forthcoming Afro-Indigenous History of the United States through Beacon Press. We'll hope to see it in 2021. Our second speaker is Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Reese. She is an award-winning associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. And her research focuses on racial literacy in teacher education, Black girl literacy, Black and Latinx male high school students. A sought-after speaker on issues of race, culturally responsive pedagogy, and diversity, Dr. Sealy works with K-12 and higher education school communities to increase their racial literacy knowledge and to move toward more equitable school experiences for their Black and Latinx students. Dr. Sealy appeared in Spike Lee's movie, Two Fists Up, We Gon' Be All Right. It's a documentary about Black Lives Matter and the campus protests at Mizzou. She has also co-authored a book with Dr. Debra Price Dennis, Advancing Racial Literacy in Teacher Education Toward Activism for Equity in Digital Spaces. And that will be published in April 2021. Her first full-length collection of poetry, Love from the Vortex and Other Poems, was published in March 2021. And her sophomore book of poetry, The Peace Chronicles, will be released in the summer of 2021. The third speaker is Dr. Benji Chang. Benjamin Chang, is an assistant professor of equity education in the School of Education and International Global Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Chang is also an adjunct faculty at the Education University in Hong Kong. Dr. Chang's work focuses on teacher education, community engagement, and language, literacy, and culture with a focus on minoritized groups and Asian diasporas. He has worked with research universities around the Pacific Rim, including as a visiting scholar in Beijing Normal University in China, McGill University in Canada, and the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Part of his work is coordinated through the Project of Critical Research, Pedagogy, and Practice, an international collaboration of student educators and research students that he has organized. In addition to publishing in venues such as Curriculum Inquiry, Linguistics and Education and Theory into Practice, Dr. Chang serves on several editorial boards, including Teachers College Record and Policy Futures in Education. He is co-editor of Critical Inquiry in Language Studies. Dr. Chang has received distinction in areas of pedagogy, literacy, Asian studies through bodies such as AERA, NCTE, and as faculty at EDUHK. He has won an Outstanding Performance Award for 5 years. Prior to UNCG, Dr. Chang was an inner city public school teacher, hip hop artist, and postdoctoral fellow at Teachers College Community, Columbia University. Dr. Dolores Calderon is an associate professor of youth, society, and justice at Western Washington University, Fairhaven College of Interdisciplinary Studies. She is from El Paso, Juarez border region, where her family, Mexican Antigua, have lived since 1680s. Her research interests include coloniality, settler colonialism, land education, and broader issues as they manifest themselves in educational contexts. Some of her research projects include examining how settler colonial ideologies manifest themselves in social studies curriculum, in teacher education, and teacher professional development. A research project she is excited about pursuing is examining how archives have been used to frame ideas of mestizaje. As a firm believer that theory is best illuminated by engagement, she values the work educators do to concretize critical perspectives. She has published in Qualitative Inquiry, Educational Studies, Environmental Educational Research, Harvard Educational Review, and Anthropology and Education Quarterly. She is also a co-author of Reclaiming the Multicultural Roots of the U.S. Curriculum, Communities of Color and Official Knowledge in Education. She is affiliated with and teaches across multiple programs at Western, included American Cultural Studies, Education and Social Justice, Law, Diversity and Justice, and the Fairhaven College Core. Some of the classes she teaches include Critical Indigenous Studies, Critical Pedagogy, Critical Race Theory in the Law, Comparative Cultural Studies, Research Methodologies, and Border Theories in Education. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Dr. Mays, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica, for the wonderful introduction. And I must say, I am very humbled to be on this panel with such amazing people and a few folks scholarship that I have known but have never met. So I'm very humbled by that and glad to be here. So I'll sort of go in and out. I'm just so fascinated and curious to learn from my peers here. So I'll get in, but I want to begin with some questions first. So the first question is really, what is the relationship between Black and Indigenous peoples? That's the first question. Really, what does that mean in the context of a settler colonial society and a society premised on white supremacy? Another question is, what does it mean to belong and to create belonging? Right, so think about belonging here. Another question, how have people of African descent created a sense of place in the US nation state? And how does this relate to Indigenous peoples and their claims to land? And I won't fully explore all those questions, but these are some of the questions that I try to interrogate in my research and things that I think are significant as we think about Black and Indigenous forms of solidarity. But in setting sort of I'm glad Dolores sort of brought up the theory part, setting up just some theory. I'll begin with the queer Black feminist Audre Lorde, because I think there's always certain assumptions about how solidarity is supposed to look like. So in a fantastic essay, Learning from the 60s, Audre Lorde stated, quote, "Any future vision which encompasses all of us by definition must be complex and expanding, not easy to achieve." Now think about that. I think there's always certain assumptions that because we are people of color, BIPOC, what have you, and we're oppressed under white supremacy, settler colonialism, other forms of racialized violence, therefore we're natural allies. And here, natural allyship, while I support it and I think it is important, it's not a natural thing, right? It is something that we have to work very hard for to actually achieve because of how embedded white supremacy is in pitting communities of color against one another. And also using Angela Davis here, quote, "I think we need to be more reflective, more critical, and more explicit about our concepts of community. There's often as much heterogeneity within a Black community or more heterogeneity than in cross-racial communities. What is problematic is the degree to which nationalism has become a paradigm for our community building processes." Right? And just to make this plain, you can have more in common with someone, if you're Black, with someone who is non-Black, whether that's ideologically or what have you, than someone that's within your so-called community. And I also just want to briefly, so I'm African-American and Saginaw Chippewa. My family is from Detroit on my dad's side and Cleveland on my mother's side. And I like to mention both, that I am African American and Native American. For the simple fact that some of these identities can be erased depending on context, time, and solidarity can be draining depending on the context and what folks like me are asked to do and participate in. You can receive anti-Blackness from one community, which has been true. There have been Native folks who have called members of my family in Detroit the N-word or other sorts of derogatory terms. My great grandmother would experience would receive a lot of criticism from especially Native men. One, because she was a strong Native woman who didn't take anything from the men, but the other reason was because she married an African American man. And in the 1960s and 70s in Detroit, that was a major issue for some, especially men within Detroit's Native community. And on the other hand, I have other folks on the other side who they're not really accepted by Black folks as well. And it's considered joking, but you know, cousins or aunties being called Pocahontas by Black men, especially within the community. So on either side, it's very difficult to often navigate some of these complexities and identities. Thus, returning to Audre Lorde, we have to constantly work at doing such work, and it's important. I wanted to just give one example of interracial solidarity, in particular historically. So I want to do this here through the example of Stokely Carmichael, who would change his name to Kwame Ture. I'm sure you've heard of Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. He popularized the phrase Black Power in Greenwood, Mississippi in June 1966. And Carmichael's showing solidarity in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1974 said, quote, "Anybody who thinks seriously about working on behalf of the red man must deal with this truth. The land on which we live, on which we inhabit, which we exploit, that land belongs to the red man. He must come first in any dealings with land." And historically, I think it's important to acknowledge that because in my understanding of history, he's one of the few people of African descent who explicitly stated that that is the U.S. settler state was not their land, and they couldn't make certain claims to that land. I'll sort of wrap up here, but I want to invoke one of my favorite writers, and I should have recommended her work, is Leanne Simpson, an Anishinaabe writer in Canada, but has contributed a lot of theory around what it means to engage in solidarity with Native people. So in the aftermath of the grand jury not indicting Darren Wilson, who murdered Michael Brown, she said, quote, "I was reminded over and over this week that Black and Indigenous communities of struggle are deeply connected through our experiences with colonialism, oppression, and white supremacy." She ended with, "To me, Ferguson is a call to not only indict the systems that create and maintain the forces of Indigenous genocide and anti-Blackness. I have a responsibility to make space on my land for those communities of struggle to center and amplify Black voices and coexist." And I think certainly since the summer or last spring, we have seen more of that from Native communities and disrupting anti-Blackness in the Native communities. And finally, I'll end here. An important question I think we should all consider: what will the world look like in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy, right? If we want to be free, if we want to end oppression and anti-Blackness and Indigenous dispossession, I think we should also, while we're working in the here and now, also try to build the world that we want to be after US empire ends. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow,
Thank
thank you. Wow, sorry, Monica.
Oh,
Go ahead.
thank you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Mays, so much. I want to, before I begin, thank this esteemed panel, thank Dean Jackson, thank Dr. Medina, and also thank you, Jason, for being behind the scenes. But Dean Jackson, I want to thank you so much for your courage of having this series, and specifically having anti-Blackness within communities of color. These are not easy conversations for us to have. And even last night, as this sat with me, I'm going to use my 10 minutes to basically show 2 videos and share 3 or 4 other slides. It's difficult even for me to sort of listen and to share this publicly. But what I believe is that we have to be explicit and open and talk about these damaging effects of white supremacy that is seeking to kill all of us, right? So that we may be able to dismantle those damaging beliefs within our communities and for the generations who come behind us. I want to share that I am on the stolen land of the Wappinger and the Lenni Lenape peoples on Turtle Island in Manhattan, also known as Manhattan in Harlem. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I thank all of you for being with us. And for those of you who find some of this difficult, I ask that you simply just sit with what it is we offer this evening. Before I do anything, I want to follow up on what Dr. Mays said by bringing in settler colonialism, bringing in, white supremacist thinking, and put all of this in perspective. We are here because 400 years ago, it was determined in 1619 when the first 20 enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, a very struggling town, a struggling economy. They arrived there, and that really boosted Jamestown. But my ancestors came with the belief that they were less than human. And so for 400 years, what we've been struggling and fighting against are systems that have this thinking embedded in it. The healthcare system, the criminal injustice system, I call it injustice system, because indeed for Black and brown folks, for the most part, and Native folks, it is a system of injustice, and certainly the education system. And so what we are struggling with within our own communities of color is a direct byproduct of white supremacy, of specific plans, actions, policies, beliefs, intents meant to separate people of color, starting all the way back in 1619. What I have on my screen here is the pyramid of white supremacy, just a visualization of what this 400 years of inequality has landed on us all. And I specifically bring up these 2 books, the Willie Lynch Letter. Some of you may or may not have heard of this, and also a recent book called Breaking the Curse of Willie Lynch. And my next 2 videos will really talk about colorism and how that manifests within communities of color. And so very quickly, Willie Lynch, who was a British slave owner, was said to have given a speech in 1712 on the banks of the James River in Virginia, and talked about his plan or his way of making sure the system of slavery would be strong. And so in some ways, he was a mentor there to other slaveholders to tell them how to keep their slaves under control. And specifically talking about this notion of colorism that lives within our communities today, he said that you must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. And then he goes on to talk about the division between males and females. When I first watched Bill Duke's Dark Girls, it was a very painful experience for me, because part of me feels that, we shouldn't give wind or to give light to these conversations of colorism that we know deeply divides our communities. But at the same time, it's important that we do talk about it so we can see really how damaging it is and how quite disgusting, right, it is that we actually see each other in this way. I have on this screen, I'm going to play a very quick trailer, but I have Toni Morrison. TT Toni inspires me because Toni Morrison specifically talks about shifting away from the white gaze and centering ourselves on the Black gaze. And I think we're going in that direction. I think communities of color are turning inward so that we can do the healing which is the damaging effects of living in a nation of 400 years of white supremacist policies. So let me play this clip, but let me remind all of us, as Toni Morrison said, we are indeed our best thing.
Rise, dark girls.
I can remember being in the bathtub asking my mom to put bleach in the water so that my skin would be lighter.
If we're all just hanging around and a dark-skinned girl will pass by, they'll be, oh, well, she's pretty for a dark-skinned girl. And I'm like, well, what is that supposed to mean?
I think I remember most saying that, you know, if I had a little girl, I didn't want her to be dark.
This is not a phenomenon. It's just a reality in the Black culture.
I mean, you know, dark-skinned women, I don't really like dark-skinned women. Like, they look funny beside me.
The impact that it has on those young children spiritually is that they actually start to devalue themselves in such a way where the spirit begins to shrink.
The consequences of not dealing with this issue is that we lay the foundation for future generations of Black women to deal with the madness. It becomes the norm for how we see ourselves.
One of the most popular products in the third world is skin whitening cream, which gives us a little bit of an idea of how people's perceptions of themselves. I mean, we're talking here about regions of the world where the overwhelming majority are not white.
We have a need for each other, a need for someone to show us, to lead us through example.
I think it's dangerous to not question things.
We need to become the architects of our own self-image. You are the keeper of your own soul.
So within that clip, we probably heard or connections to this idea of Patricia Williams and Bettina Love talking about spirit murdering. Certainly some of you may have thought about the Mamie Clark and Kenneth Clark, the doll test, which was a specific and important part of the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. What's important also is to hear how so-called third world countries across the world, and this includes spaces in the Philippines, students that have told me about skin bleaching creams that their parents use. It's really, you know, it was quite disturbing, right? And so what I want to do is talk about how it manifests within our Latinx community. Certainly within our Black communities of color, but also within our Latinx communities. So this kind of disease spreads throughout. And let me share this.
I'm sorry, you had 2 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'll do is I will skip that video and I will ask all of you to please write this down. And in your leisure, look up the video, What Afro-Latinos Want You to Know. And Julissa Calderon, who is on my right, has also been a very important spokesperson. She's in Gentefied, which is a show I think is either on Netflix, but she wrote a very powerful column in Oprah magazine last year, talking about it's time for Latinx to step up for Black Lives Matter, for us to really understand the damaging effects of white supremacist thinking and to have us in solidarity, right? Number one, educate ourselves, but then also to move forward in solidarity with one another. And as we looked at the horrific murders that happened the other night in Atlanta, once again, in conversation is this idea of Black and Asian tensions, but also a conversation around Black and Asian solidarity. And in yesterday's, I call it The Voice, but some may pronounce it Vox, there was a very powerful article that talked about the history of tensions and solidarity between Black and Asian American communities, and quite frankly, understanding the role of white supremacy economically and historically pitting these two communities against one another. But what I like to do is just quickly in my last minute, sort of remind us as Latinx folks and Black folks have been in solidarity, as Black folks across various colors and ethnicities have been in solidarity. We have always been in solidarity for resistance of what white supremacy has done to us. And in this case, I want to look at some of the Black and Asian solidarity, looking from Frederick Douglass in 1869, speaking in support of Chinese when there was a lot of resistance to Chinese immigration. Ida B. Wells speaking against the American-Filipino War. W.E.B. Du Bois traveling with his wife twice to the People's Republic of China and speaking and writing very favorably about the nation. The overwhelming Black presence in Vietnam War, where double the amount of Black soldiers, male soldiers died, but overwhelmingly Black people writ large being against that war. And then certainly, but not finally, Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, who is known for holding the head of Malcolm X when he died in the Audubon Ballroom, were two Asian sisters who were very strong in the liberation and abolitionist movement, but very specifically the Black liberation movement. And I'll end by sharing that last night, this is an action. It calls for all of us to find ourselves and not just speak about it, but to move towards action. So last night I began, I'm part of a group called Black and Gold Forum, really initiated by Jose Antonio Vargas. And at Teachers College last night, we had this event of my former student, Michael Cho, my friend and sister, Judy Chu, and a call out to all who were online to remember, as I call Sankofa, to remembering our solidarity historically as we move forward in history. And history meaning move forward in the present, because you have to look back to know where you're going. So thank you for that time.
Okay. Am I up?
Okay. Yes, you are.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Excuse me if I cough a little bit. I'm a little bit under the weather. I have a toddler at home that got a little sick, and we just got the vaccination, so it's a little bit of sickness over here. Like the others, I want to thank Dean Jackson and everyone at the IUPUI for putting this together. It's an honor to be invited to this esteemed panel. Some of the folks here, I've been relying on their works for some time now, and just everybody's work is inspiring as well. The Dean already acknowledged, and so did Dr. Yoli, about the tragedies that have happened by what appears to be yet another white male supremacist with a gun. We've got a lot of work to do between our BIPOC communities, as this panel is about. But we should be affirmed and proactive in our work to dismantle white supremacy, and not just on those bad days that that police officer was talking about. As I've been like a lot of people, checking in today, and it's a little weird to talk about it. So like that violence is very much, that rage is very much inside, and that pain. I think a lot about violence, and how over the past 5 years, I've been able to travel or work in 14 countries. One of the lasting comparative lessons I've learned across these various countries is the US's degree of violence, from the military industrial complex to the police state. I think about my youth being harassed by, supposedly being a gang member, and the cop that used to harass us ended up, he made the news finally because he killed a homeless white man in Orange County and got off, of course, he got acquitted. We're reminded of the state-sanctioned violence and its complicitness with white supremacy, capitalism, et cetera, and how we have to fight that. Much of my talk today draws from a paper entitled Asian Americans in Education in 2017 that kind of breaks down the various communities that fall under this monolithic umbrella, and a paper called 2020, a paper called From Illmatic to Kung Flu, Black and Asian Solidarity, Activism, and Pedagogies in the COVID-19 Era, some of which draws upon what Dr. Yoli referred to in terms of Du Bois, Grace Lee Boggs, and others. In general, I approach this work suggesting and trying to learn from intersectional and transnational approaches when considering the Asian American monolith, because there's so many different things going on, and it doesn't necessarily all go together in terms of some of the ways that we've racialized thinking about equity, social justice, and interracial relations. So I think about those things as we talk about intra and inter-community divisions. So I want to talk about some roots of tensions between Asian and Black communities. As we know from our studies, whether those could be from racial formation, post-colonial theory, who or what is considered Asian and or Black is a slippery concept that continues to change. For example, the term in and of itself, is it Asian, Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific Islander, Desi American, and all those point to positionalities of inclusion, exclusion, and historical issues that have popped up within this Asian monolith. But this has been highly shaped by European and US colonizers, typically informed by ideologies of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and Orientalism. Post-contact, we see global examples of the colonizers' divide and conquer tactics, typically putting ethnic groups against each other. You could see examples of that with South Asians in South Africa and the British and Dutch colonies and stuff, and certain people being the workers and pitting them against each other, or having a certain ethnic group that looks a certain way, have them be the police, bring them in from another country and have them do law enforcement upon other peoples of color. So all of this within a fight for limited employment. So post 1865 emancipation, this is a major policy strategy for cheap labor from the Caribbean to Hawaii, especially for Orientals who increase industrial profit, but are simultaneously portrayed as disease-carrying infidels, which relates to Trump's recent coining of the term Kung Flu, so original, taking jobs from working class and Black locals. So a recent pop culture example of that is that Warrior TV show that's now on HBO, I believe, where it shows Chinese migrants going to California and fighting the local Irish for jobs. Post-1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, we see a dramatic shift in positioning of these kind of working class Orientals. There were some elites that went to like major, Ivy League universities and stuff, but those were very few. In terms of the majority of people before 1965, they're coming as working class. But you see a dramatic shift with thousands of graduate students and folks from the middle class coming over with various forms of capital. And within post-Vietnam, we see early waves of refugees and migrants. They typically had privilege over latter groups that came, but those are some of the same groups that popular discourse and policymakers have kind of zeroed in on and said, look, these are the model minority. Why can't the rest of y'all Black and brown people achieve like them? They did it, but not kind of acknowledging some of the privilege of those folks that kind of initially came over that they're pointing to. All of this supports the model minority myth that undoubtedly many of you are familiar with, and post-civil rights power movements, where we see various examples, including that recent film about the Messiah and Fred Hampton in the Black Panther Party, a lot of nervousness about revolution and people of color rising up. So using Asian Americans as a racial wedge, especially at the same time as cities are moving away from factory jobs, which are typically things that Black folks had middle class or at least working opportunities post World War II. Some key works here that I've drawn from, including Lisa Lowe, Gary Okihiro, Vijay Prashad, Shilpa Dave, and others. So some ideas in terms of pedagogical projects to build solidarity and activism. The previous slide indicates some of the many complexities of who fits under this massive umbrella. I think the last time I checked, it was around 40 different ethnic national groups, and it gets very messy. And some of the many divides within the Asian community itself, including when did you get here? How did you get here? What was your socioeconomic status when you left wherever you came from and then arrived here? Colorism, religion, etc. And these have major implications for Black Asian engagement. An example we were talking about the other day when we had our prep meeting was a question that I think about was posed to me when I was working in the nonprofit industry shortly after getting my PhD, where there was this, we met with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, and the Urban League, and I was representing the Asian group civil rights and stuff, and there's a couple staffers with me. And when we got there, the vice president of the Urban League said, "Oh, y'all are here, great. You know, we would love to have the issues that you all have." And that was just like this gut response, like, ooh, model minority. But at the same time, understanding, you know, the complexities of what she had just said and trying to take that and work with that. In my 2020 paper, I tried to think about some of those things and unpack those things. And I break it down to 3 chunks: shared histories of activism and social movements, going from pre-World War instances with Du Bois, Paul Robeson, et cetera, connections with the communist movement in China and other parts of the world, and Northern Africa, and also with regard to the Black Panther Party and the power movements and their connections to Asian communities and revolutionary movements, both internationally and domestically. I also talk about Asian martial arts and Black liberation, and how some GIs from Southeast Asia conflicts and Korea also brought some of their knowledge and their studies of martial arts from over there, and also the healing, the traditional medicine and alternative ways of knowing. And finally, the hip hop community building from the US to Asia and back again, just kind of talking about some of those things and the dynamics of that, and how a lot of that kind of gets swept under the rug under like monoracial social movements, or just kind of essentializing things that are, it's either this group or that group, or maybe it's just 2 of them, but that's about it. I think 2 of the previous speakers mentioned immigrant settler colonialism. And I think that is something that doesn't get addressed enough as we vacillate between talking about the oppressed minority and the model minority. One of the problematic histories, especially with Black people's, in terms of Asian folks coming over here, is immigrant settler colonialism. And that has happened in various regions of the country and various territories and stuff. And I think that particular area also involves talking about the indigenous folks are there, like say in the Pacific Islands and stuff. So that particular area of research and scholarship can kind of push us, and the practices and activism that they've done over there. Aside from the previous intra-Asian issues, there's one more thing I want to mention. And I'm from California, and I know a couple people here have UCLA connections, but in Asian American studies, Stephen Sumina coined this term East of California. And that California is such its own thing, especially like in the Bay Area, LA, et cetera, that the solidarity work done from Oakland and to other parts of the state don't necessarily reflect the everyday realities of, say, like where I am in the South now, in North Carolina and other communities. So as we think about how the concrete material conditions for doing the solidarity and activist work, being aware of the historical practices, the need for an intersectional and transnational analysis when thinking about Asian communities, and also kind of getting out of certain paradigms of location and thinking about space and stuff. Those are just kind of some of the suggestions that I have. So thank you. Let's dialogue further, and there's my information. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Dean Jackson, and everyone else. I am truly, truly honored and inspired to be here with everyone. And it's wonderful how always the talks come together and we truly are building on one another's conversations here. And so I'm really happy to be able to start after Benji's or Dr. Chang, sorry, apologies, about space. And in my conversation, I'm briefly going to talk about nuancing racialization and disrupting anti-Blackness, but with young people thinking about ethnic studies K through 12. And I say this particularly because I do teaching in what is essentially ethnic studies, but for undergrads, and dealing with a lot of 18, 19-year-olds that are, you know, a year out of high school, and I'm a former high school teacher. The best way that I've been able to teach these comparative ethnic studies classes is really to teach them about the racialization of whites, because oftentimes students take for granted, and I think it promotes a particular type of virulent anti-Blackness, the racialization of whites. And what's particularly revealing for a lot of, because I teach majority white students, is that there was opportunities for whites to ally themselves throughout the history of the United States, but they had material benefits. And that's what I think is important about an ethnic studies education, but also nuancing racialization and disrupting anti-Blackness. And so space, place, and history, I think everyone before me has talked about this, remains important, because I grew up in a pretty homogeneous community of El Paso, and I grew up in the Lower Valley of El Paso, right on the border. I mean, the border wall's right next to us. And I didn't grow up around white people. So when I got to critical spaces, I was like, yeah, we need teachers of color in the classroom, but we need critical teachers of color, not just bodies of color, because they maintain the same things: anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity. So some of the dominant racialization projects in our community were linguicism, where you were from, accent, things like that. So a marked anti-Mexicanness was the dominant kind of racialization project that people were acting against. But also, I also think that we need to emphasize anti-Blackness. And in saying that, I think all of us agree, is by emphasizing anti-Blackness, we aren't necessarily arguing for diminishing the struggles of other peoples. But what I think it helps us do is think about a complex way to think about how white supremacy works in the United States. So for instance, the reason I say that is because I've seen in social media, particularly around young people, a troubling move towards talking about race in biological terms, right? And so race is this very standard, very flat way. So things such as like, oh, well, Mexican isn't race, it's a nationality, so they can't experience racism. Right? I work with a lot of young people, so I'm seeing these really flat conversations. And so one of the things we work on in our ethnic studies classes that we start off in college is, what is racialization? What does social constructions of race mean? But one of the most important things that has led me to think about why ethnic studies K through 12 is this beautiful working team that I've put up here: Annalise, Dr. Annalise from WWU, Renee Swanway, and Cynthia Wilson from Lummi Nation, and the work that we do in supporting the Lummi Nation in their desires for their children to be healthy and loved. And so for me, this means that we must work with white teachers. And so here, this is a kind of a list of the work that we've done that I've been really proud to support. And so it looks different here in the Pacific Northwest. It looks different here, particularly on the border with Canada, what these things can look like. But it was Renee Swanway who said, like, we want our children to be loved because of the history of schooling has been so violent. And so for me, what does that mean? It means particularly being in relationship to the local communities. And I think Dr. Yolanda Seeley-Reese talked about it, right? And Dr. Mays talked about it too, is that our communities are complicated. But our communities are also having these conversations, and sometimes these conversations are hard to be had. And so many times our ethnic studies approaches are vulturistic, right? They can come and look from the outside, but rather thinking about how other approaches and research protocols about doing the work in an ethical way with our communities can really help guide the work going forward. And so for me, ethnic studies is obviously interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, ancestral, and futurist, right? So these are just some of the folks that I look to draw the work. These are academics, and so community is part of it, but so we're academics. I think some of the important work of these theorists who were activists at the same time help us nuance in conversations of race, racism, racialization, in particular ways. And I teach a critical race theory in the law class. And let me tell you, revisiting those works in these moments illuminates just how important the work of a Derek Bell, of a Cheryl Harris, Kimberly Crenshaw, who continues, right, to do this important work, particularly around gender, of Haney Lopez's work, Social Construction of Race. When students read Hudgens v. Wright, which is the case that people were literally debating phonetics and Blackness, it becomes crystal clear to them that anti-Blackness is situated in the very structures of our society. It allows them to understand that social construction has a very real consequences for people. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, it's about the way it gets built into our society, into our legal systems, into our housing structures, in particular ways. But what I also think is important about all this work is that this is something that should be nuanced. And I'm particularly thinking here of the work of Saldaña Portillo, who talks about genealogies of racialization. She's not the only one. So in pointing to these people, there's a lot of different peoples who talk about these things. So for instance, in the Southwest, I don't know if you all have kept up with what's going on there, you have Hispano communities who are very proud of their Spanish roots and are anti-Indigenous and anti-Black at the same time, promoting a particular type of Hispano settler colonialism, if you want to call it that, that was built on the caste colonialism of the region that is still very present today. So if we don't understand the nuances of space, place connected to history, we miss the opportunity to do the critical hard work of ethnic studies K through 12. And that means attending to just not only the nuances of place, but also realizing and accepting the dominance of anti-Black racism as a particular type of organizing category for people. Even as we come into this country, say as immigrants, those are some of the particular things that you get introduced to. So these things must come together, the nuance of place and the nuance of history. And the nuance of the contemporary ways that these things happen. And so I always return to Cheryl Harris's article, Whiteness as Property, which to me, like, we have a lot of work that's talked about conquest and slavery. And she theorizes slavery and conquest to illuminate the relationships between whiteness and property in this particular article. And this drives me to the point of property, of how property becomes internalized within communities, and then how it becomes this idea of things are as they should be. So what do I mean by that? So again, this turning of, in particularly to race as biology. So we're seeing a resurgence of race as biology, particularly even in critical communities in interesting ways. When people don't have an understanding of nuance of how racialization processes happen. So ethnic studies K through 12 has a deep responsibility to disrupt anti-Black notions of race, particularly race as biology, right? So I'm thinking of Derek Bell, right? He has the nomenclature of race. He walks us through all that. I mean, it's not like we have a proliferation of people's work who do this stuff. And so the disruption, however, is necessary for what Catherine McKittrick names, quote, how freedom is imagined and enacted through our extra-human worlds.
You have 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm. And
Yep.
so I just put this link here. It's going to be shared with you all. But one of the things that particularly strikes me today is that, we're in the midst of COVID and its disparate racial project of racialization. So for me, ethnic studies K through 12 has to have direct implications with the work then that our young people are going to be doing in community, because we absolutely need people to be doing direct action work in our communities. And for me right now, one of the focuses that I'm thinking about is public health. And so one of the things that this person talked about in the book that I've shared, what's it called? Fatal Invention, is just how we talk about disease. So we talk about sickle cell disease as a racialized disease, for instance, but we actually know it's based on region and it's connected to malaria. But we oftentimes in science talk about race as a proxy for health rather than white supremacy as the reason for the disparities. And so I think ethnic studies K through 12 has the responsibility to help us understand and imagine different and other stories beyond the stories we've been told about ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, I know this is difficult to do in 10 minutes, but I also really appreciate how you were able to bring this all together. Each and every one of you did present very different perspectives, but there were some very clear themes that seemed to emerge, and those are sense of identity and who defines us, sense of community and who is a part of that community, and also the history and how important history is for us. So I do want to open the floor up for some questions. We have a couple of questions here, but I also want to let people know that Dr. Celie Reese, because she's very busy, has another commitment and may have to leave before the session. So she's not just leaving us, but we really appreciate you making the time to be here. So there is one question that is offered to all of the panelists here. And the question is, I often have Latinx students who use the N-word, and I have tried having the conversation with them about the origin of that word and giving them historical context of anti-Blackness in Latino America that originates from Spain caste systems. And I have yet to break through. It tends to cause tension and some sort of race divide bubbles in the classroom because of it. So I'm assuming we may have some strategies, some ideas. Dr. Celie Reese, would you like to go first?
Sure. I was actually thinking about you, Benji, in terms of, hip hop and how, my nephew, who is a hip hop artist, and that word is dropped, maybe every 3 or so, bars or lines. I'm thinking about the work of Randall Kennedy, who wrote a 412-page book on the N-word. I'm thinking that Dick Gregory wrote 2 autobiographies, both of that title. And I'm thinking about my own experience with colleagues here in my program a few years ago who felt it was their freedom of speech to use that term, and how they vehemently kind of worked against what I was sharing, talking about how hurtful that word is. And I personally abhor the word. I recognize it, how it's been commodified and used in hip hop is a music that I love. So I recognize the complexity of that. And what I have done, I'll tell you, since that very hurtful incident with my colleagues, is I took that incident after I talked to the president, and I'm very vocal about this. And I felt she should have been fired. I just want to tell you, I told my diversity officer that, but instead she was given an opportunity to leave as a buyout. But I took it as a learning experience. And so in my diversity class, there are 2 full weeks dedicated to discussing that word. And I think sometimes as adults, because we have a certain feeling or connection with it, we want to tell young people don't use it. And we don't really give them an opportunity to not just know the history of the Portuguese or how it originated, but also how it's evolved. So what I do, I collect everything from Boondocks cartoons to Caretha Mitchell's podcast on, never to use the word, Jay Smooth, why Gwyneth Paltrow and other whites shouldn't do it. Eminem's interview, why he doesn't use it. Rain Pryor, Richard Pryor's daughter, who did a podcast to say when her father went to Ghana and he came back, he never used the word again. And so I think it's all in our education that we have to educate ourselves and then create spaces within the classroom for multiple viewpoints, for there to be a critical dialogue and not just kind of, well, you shouldn't use it because of this painful history. We all fall on different sides of what that is, but I think we have to allow our young people to understand the complexity, the evolution of how it's used. I also use Def Comedy Jam, Curry's beautiful poem. So that's what I would say to the professor. Go a little bit deeper on what you're doing. You do your own kind of look of how you are opening it up in the classroom, bring in multiple sources, and allow conversation to happen. I don't know what you were thinking. I don't mean to just go to you, Benji, and to you, Kyle, you know, Dr. Mays, but I immediately go to hip hop because it's a music that I love. And it is a music that has a very tense-filled relationship with the word.
Thank you.
I'll just be real quick. So in 2007 in Detroit, the NAACP they had a whole processional, tried to bury the N-word, so to speak. I think they failed. I don't remember the N-word site being used. And unlike Dr. Sheila Reese, I'm in the other side. Like I think it's okay. And I remember teaching in a learning history through hip hop course at a juvenile detention center. And I did a whole week's worth of lessons on the N-word, and just talking with they were I mean, you know, it's a incarcerated space, but they were all African American, and I talked to them about it, and they said that their friends use it, their white friends, their Latinx friends, all their friends use it. And, you know, as a teacher, I didn't want to judge them for this. And I think you want to look at and just be curious about why they're using it, what does that mean to them, and how they're using it. And I think also with Dr. Sheila Reese said, just all you can do is educate them. And maybe they'll grow out of it once they get older. I do know folks that once they get out of it in a certain way, they stop using it. They just I just don't think it's appropriate. Even talking to peers and adults of different races and cultures who have different connections to hip hop. But it's not going anywhere is the other thing too. And it's just how you discuss it with them. And also for the most part, and I'm conservative about who can say it, but I also I try not to censor too much of young people that much to stop their creativity, except around certain sorts of things where I feel like the word is used in a very violent way.
When I think about this term, and it did come up in my work over the years, say with Latinx youth that also maybe have Puerto Rican roots or are actually African American themselves, but that's not the part of the identity that necessarily sticks out, that is visible in terms of their name or other types of things. Actually, I found the word to be used as kind of like in solidarity, because and so this is how they presented it. And so instead of my kind of like gut reaction, just like stop, come down on them, and then start to reify that teacher student hierarchy and stuff, it was like, hold up, let me think about, let's be dialogical. Where's this coming from? And so they talk about like even like Southeast Asian youth, say from Cambodia that are Khmer that have dark skin. They're like, that's me. Like the police doesn't care. Like when they see me, they treat me the same way. And you know, the school system, and we go to the same schools, we live in the same neighborhood. So it's different depending on what kind of group of students, what's the context. And so very context, you know, it depends on the context. So I think about like pedagogically, how are we approaching the students about that and trying to understand where they're coming from. Now, if there was a situation where they weaponized it and use it to be hurtful, like that's another thing, like directly. But when it comes to like some of the broader things, like saying, you know, when they refer to each other, like it's like an interchangeable word with homie or something like that, then, you know, like we talk about it. But yeah, so that's just kind of like my quick take on it.
And if I could just follow up on that real quick, the other thing is, and I think Dr. Che, you've probably seen this too, most of them have a sense of when they cannot use it. Not always, but they have some sense of when they cannot use it.
Anyone else have any, before I go on to the next question?
No, I'm just thinking about how, you know, white supremacy is going to eventually just kill us all, or it just, as much as we try to get away, like Tony, right? I'm looking at you, Sister Calderon. We try to get away from the white gaze. It's like it's so in everything in our lives, in our language, and the work that we have to do to even explain how we use language or choose not to use language is just a bit exhausting. And I was just thinking how grateful I am for this panel and for my colleagues and how exhausting white supremacy is. That's actually what I was thinking.
But each and every one of you in some way talked about sense of community, talked about sense of coalition building. How do we do this, right? Not just to educate our own communities, because I think that's where it begins, but also this neoliberal agenda, right? That to me is probably the biggest dragon that we need to slay in many of our urban communities. Anyone want to speak about that?
I think we were waiting for you, Professor Calderon, because we already spoke. So just trying to, you know,
All
equity
right.
of air, equity of air.
Yeah, wow, neoliberalism in education, right? That's a whole other. I mean, the thing is, like, truly, I think we probably are all abolitionists, deschoolers, decolonization, right? So I'm thinking of the work of sorry, my tongue gets tripped up on English words. Apocalyptic Education of Dr. Kenjus Watson and Tiffany Marie, where they look at, okay, so schools are killing our children. Why do we keep sending them there? And that's, we have to deal with that. But at the same time, we still work in schools because our children are still in schools. But I have to take that proposition seriously because, like I said, I'm teaching mostly white students. And the burden on me is extractive. Like, how, and I think you can look at our stories and there's extractivism going on in all our stories, like how we were extracted from our communities, right? And so I think we need to take up neoliberalism, but also question, I'm working towards the end of what I do. I mean, and that's hard for me to say and admit because I'm like, it's hard for me to imagine, well, I need a job. I need really good healthcare because of, I mean, I think we probably all know or deal with chronic health issues as a result of white supremacy. But for me, like the work of Kenjus Watson and Tiffany Marie and the work that they're doing is, I think, I don't want to say antidote. How am I thinking about this? But just something to look at, something to think about. Where are we going? And I think Dr. Mays talked about it, like, how do we imagine our future? And I think they're doing that in the now. So it's not a direct answer to neoliberalization, or maybe it is, but I'm struggling with I work in schools directly with white teachers. And I want to imagine something different too, as well.
Thank you very much. We have another question, and that is, given the white supremacy racism is a disruptive force in the lives of all people of color, what is gained by shifting the label anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, etc. racism?
I need my panelists. I'm not sure if I understand the question fully.
Well, let me repeat it again. So the question is, given that white supremacy racism is a disruptive force in the lives of all people of color, what is gained by shifting the label anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, etc. racism?
Is it shifting, meaning shifting from white supremacy to anti? I wonder if that's what the person is thinking of.
Exactly. I'm reading that into the question.
No, Monica, Dr. Medina, thank you. I think, and I need my panelists' help here. I think we don't want to get tripped up in semantics either, right? Because
exactly,
whatever it's called, it's still killing us, right? It's still, I think when we talk about anti, for me, as an abolitionist, it's what I'm working towards. I'm working towards kind of stopping that. I'm against it. I'm against racism. I'm against homophobia. I'm against Islamophobia. I'm against. So that's what it is for me. It's more of an action word versus sort of taking in, you know, white supremacy is happening, you know, on. For me, it's what am I working against? I think about Dr. Jamila Liskott at Amherst. He says, what are you fighting for? What are you fighting against? So for me, using the word anti is very clear what I'm focused on fighting against. I suppose it's the effects of white supremacy, which has created all of these isms and phobias. That's my take on understanding the question. I'm
Thank
not sure
you.
what my colleagues are thinking.
Yeah, I was thinking about like being very particular about the particular issue that someone's focused on. For instance, settler colonialism impacts everyone, but it impacts indigenous peoples very differently in some ways. Not, and I'm just for sake of answering the question, in very particular ways of removing them from land. At the same time, which we often sort of erase, the enslaved Africans who were kidnapped were indigenous peoples. And then my question I keep raising recently is, when did they lose their indigenous roots? Because that's sort of the assumption. So even talking about the particularities of how settler colonialism, for example, impacts Native people versus also impacting other people in very sometimes different, sometimes overlapping ways too, depending on context and relationships as well.
Thank you. There's another question here. And it says, how do you deal with burnout when dealing with staff that have racist ideas and tendencies? I find conversations with them far more draining than the combos I have with my students. I often get my admin reaching out to do race equity PD for our staff. In their last push, I said, no, I do not want to do the training because these conversations and other spaces I have make white people cry with tough conversations. Definitely not proud of it, but I do think their tears came from a place of white guilt and fragility. I recognize we need that training, but I don't want to keep being asked to do it.
Maybe I'll say something. And I think within the like social justice education literature within the past like 10, 15 years, it's gotten better at talking about dealing with like personal trauma, healing, thinking about our health, kind of like still addressing, you know, wanting to be fierce, wanting to be a warrior for the movement and taking things on, but stepping back from some of those like kind of war soldier kind of metaphors and things like that, and some of the machismo that we saw in previous decades, which also reminds me of that white supremacy question that just came up, because I think naming things other than just white supremacy helps us to kind of address the different things that are going on. If it's just white supremacy, some of the other things might get washed away, such as like, say, within the Panthers themselves or the American Indian movement, there was, you know, sexism, patriarchy going on and things like that. So some of that kind of got covered up by the focus on like race or the race question from a, you know, Marxist perspective. So kind of coming back to the question at hand, though, I think that I think about some of the community organizing work and thinking about developing community, not only to challenge power, but also just in terms of the love that comes out of it, the bonds, to sustain ourselves. And I think like students are not always enough to do that. It's definitely needed to be done with students, but in terms of with colleagues and other people outside of that space is also important, just to take care of ourselves and think about it beyond just like kind of the work paradigm, just some of the things that kind of come to my mind.
Other thought about that question?
Sure. I think what I'll add is I think the health, I'm really thinking a lot about health as I talked about consequences of what this question also asks is to take seriously kind of what disability studies is pushing us to think about as well, is also how we set ourselves up for early death by doing this work in a lot of ways. And it's not being facetious. I mean, it's like we've seen it time and time again. Our ancestors' dreams were for us to thrive, not in these middle class lives, though, that we're still ending early beyond. And I think, Kim Tallbear talks about this and other scholars. She's a Dakota scholar who talks about like, we live so others can live better, right? And so by others living better, it takes away from us. So I'm about very explicitly naming that, like, this action is taking away so much time of my life and so much time of my relationships with the people that matter, right? Because I'm also thinking about caretaking versus parenthood, right? That's a really gendered term that I'm moving away from. And so how can we be better caretakers for ourselves and for our communities, right? We're lucky in some ways that we have increased community outreach, but I'm also a racial realist in terms of Derek Bell and what he's talked about and others. He's not the only one, but I don't know how much. I'll stop there because I don't want to get into this other thing, my own kind of like pessimism. And I don't want to put that out there yet, but I think we should be careful with our bodies and our futures and really kind of, we talk about, we're the wildest dreams our ancestors had for us. How are we manifesting that, right? How am I taking care of myself in a way that I can honor the short lives or the lives that ended too early of those that came before me, right? Like I really want to honor them and be like, no, your legacy has to mean more than that.
I can add just really quickly is sometimes you have to walk away and not listen to white people talk about some of these things, frankly. Especially as Dr. Calderon just mentioned, like some of these things are draining, literally killing you, affecting your mental health as well as physical health. And, depending on the time and circumstance, as a teacher, often you're more than willing to stay and even listen to your colleagues and peers, but they can also educate themselves as well, right? So don't always feel the need to sit there and listen to the white guilt and then it's taking off seconds, minutes, days of your own life. Like you don't have to do that. And if you feel better another day, sure, if you want to give the energy, but you absolutely don't have to do that.
Absolutely. It's not our responsibility to educate others, particularly those that do not want to be educated. We can give them the space, the place, but ultimately it's their choice and their voice. So I really appreciate your comment on that. So I believe that we have, as a community, we have paid attention now to the call for more anti-racist, anti-Black racist education. But oftentimes we just don't know where to go or what to do. We get caught up in theory, but we're not always very sure how to do the action. So my next question for you is, how do we create that solidarity? And in your experiences, what have you done to create that sense of community, particularly with communities who have been silenced by others? Please.
I need a moment to think about it. I'm still
Okay.
processing.
That's okay. So another question kind of popped up, and it's kind of similar to that one. And is it possible to develop a united front that would benefit and advance all groups or people of color? And what would such unity be called? What would it look like?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. But I do think because of the history of whiteness in this country, and there have been moments of allyship and solidarity. And I don't know if Dr. Calderon is going here, but I will be pessimistic. It's just hard, except for exceptions. There aren't too many John Browns, Viola Luisa, etc. Amongst white people. There's a lot of white liberals, and that is a real issue that continues to persist. And even with the increase in anti-racism, I like to call it the anti-racist sort of industrial complex that kind of persists. You see people gravitating towards some of these things, and then it's as if, what is the meaning then of anti-racism if you can learn it and unlearn it so easily and so quickly without, I think Dr. Chang is alluding to it, and I'm with you there, about some real materialist and a deep understanding of capitalism or racial capitalism. Then without that, we're not going to really expand and do much of anything. I mean, what's the point of anti-racism without a critique, a real sustained critique of racial capitalism and organizing around some of those very particular issues? And finally, one of the things I would always like to imagine, at least in my world, is how can we get Black, Indigenous, Latinx elders together in other communities and just talk without the gaze of whiteness.
That's so important. I just want to share a really quick story about that struck that home to me, about how racial capitalism really kind of has to be front and fundamental into the work we did. I had the chance to, my cousin who's an immigration attorney in El Paso was working with two Mayan Ixil refugees, Fernando and Gaspar, who are really well known in kind of the human rights community and were being detained in Juarez. And we were in Juarez, and I went and I asked for them, do you want coffee? And he looked at me and he said, coffee? No, coffee has killed us. And so at that moment, I was like, God damn, I'm such an American, such a USian, right? I was like, but it was a reminder for me that I have my privileges as someone who is really kind of in the heart of this capitalist monster, right? And even, working class self wouldn't have kind of experience that Fernando and Gaspar kind of were like, and they were teaching me, very deliberately teaching me, like, it's like, okay, this is what solidarity can look like. It's complex, it's hard work. But for me, that was such an important moment. And I think Benji, Dr. Chang talked about that as well, right? In his work that he's been doing, this kind of, that for me, solidarity has to think about like my role in capitalism. I mean, obviously I'm not going to change it, but it informs my politics, right? So I'm anti-capitalist, right? In my politics, very explicitly.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I could add something. I'm ready, but
yes.
Dr. Medina, but for moving on, that's fine.
No, please. We have time.
Okay, cool. So, okay, I'm gonna try, because I was still thinking about the neoliberalism thing, and then trying to make some connections. In trying to make connections with, say, in the context of schooling communities, some of the policies and effects of the neoliberal push within the last 20 plus years is a potential organizing point or point of solidarity across racialized communities. And I've, in some of the work that I like to like check out, and things being done in communities, and even here in the South with working class white folks, they may be uncomfortable talking about racial justice. But if we can talk about some of the things around testing and how schools are run and profits and the corporate agenda and stuff like that, they can engage and then we can kind of, as educators and with the pedagogy, kind of a problem posing pedagogy, we can approach with them with those types of things. So so that's one part of it in terms of making those connections. And then I'm thinking, I believe it was Dr. Calderon mentioned, I was about to call it Lil, and then also Dr. Mays thinking about across generations and our elders. And sometimes they remind us to slow down, sustain yourself. And also I think the literature or the decolonizing work and where we're at kind of right now is reminding ourselves to eat, to exercise, to sing, dance, and bring a certain joy to this work. It doesn't have to be with a certain amount of like, I mean, it's going to be heavy regardless. But if we're gonna fight the man, then at least we can have some fun doing it, and bring all that together. What unfortunately happens under neoliberalism is some of that kind of gets pulled to the side, and let's bring the song and the dance and put it in a new Disney princess movie or something like that, and leave it over there. But actually, just kind of like sticking forward and kind of moving forward with that. So those are some of the things I think about in order to sustain this work, and how draining the emotional labor. I got hit with some of that today around like, can you talk about the Asian stuff? Okay, yeah. So from leadership in the administration of this school here. So anyways, those are some of the things that I think about in terms of, I think about sustainability and how we can try to thrive and bring joy to this work.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all of your wonderful words that you leave us with this evening. And I hope that all of you have enjoyed the wealth of information that they have shared with us tonight. When you end this webinar, there will be some prompts requesting your feedback and an invitation to review resources around tonight's topic. We will appreciate you pausing to take time to complete the survey, review the resources shared by tonight's presenters. And lastly, we hope that you can join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the post discussion. Information will be included in the survey, or you can go to our website, education.iupui.edu. Thanks again to our panelists. Yay. And this concludes our webinar. Please stay safe and have a good evening.